The dusty pickup truck rolled down Main Street like a ghost from another time. Behind the wheel sat a man who looked older than his 26 years, his hands rough from 8 years of hard work under different skies. The morning sun caught the stubble on his jaw as he squinted through the windshield at a town that seemed frozen in time. Cedar Valley looked exactly like he remembered, yet somehow smaller. The water tower still stood guard over the grain elevator. Murphy's Diner still had that same faded red sign that had been there since before he was born. Even the crack in the sidewalk outside the post office was still there. Like an old scar that never quite healed, he pulled into the gravel parking. Lot of the diner, dust clouds swirling around his tires. The engine ticked as it cooled, and for a moment he just sat there, watching through the big windows as people moved around inside. Normal people living normal lives in the place he used to call home. The bell above the door chimed the same tired tune when he pushed inside. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they got quieter. Eyes followed him as he walked to the counter, the kind of polite staring that small towns perfected. Everyone knew who he was, even after all this time. In a place like Cedar Valley, 8 years might as well be 8 minutes. That's when he saw her. She was behind the counter, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same style of uniform the diner had used for decades. But it was definitely her, same warm brown eyes, same way of moving with quiet confidence. She looked up from wiping down the coffee machine and their eyes met across the room. For a second, time stopped. 8 years collapsed into nothing. Then she smiled, not the shocked expression he expected, but something softer. Something that said she'd been expecting this moment for a long time. Coffee? She asked, like he'd been coming in every morning. For 8 years instead of being gone for 8 years? Black, he said, settling onto one of the worn vinyl stools. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She poured without asking if he was sure, without the usual small talk about cream. And sugar, she remembered. Of course she remembered. In a town this size, you remembered everything about everyone, especially the ones who mattered. The coffee was still the same blend Murphy had used since the place opened. Strong enough to wake the dead, his father used to say. The warmth spread through his chest as he took that first sip, and suddenly he was 18 again, sitting in this same spot before school, complaining about algebra tests and football practice. "You hungry?" she asked, pulling out her order pad. "Kitchen's got fresh biscuits. What else you got?" "Same menu as always. Nothing fancy, but it's good food." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and something twisted in his chest. She'd done that same gesture in high school when she was nervous or thinking hard about something. "Eggs over easy wheat toast?" "Hash browns," he said. She wrote it down without surprise. "Still the same order. Some things don't change." "Some things do," she said quietly, tearing off the ticket and clipping it to the wheel for the cook. The morning crowd started filtering. And while he waited for his food, ranchers grabbing coffee before heading out to check cattle, store owners opening up for another day of business, retired folks who came in every morning just to have somewhere to go and people to talk to. Old Pete Henderson recognized him first. "Well, I'll be damned if it isn't the Morrison boy." Word spread through the diner like wildfire. Handshakes and backslaps followed. Questions about where he'd been, what he'd been doing, how long he was staying. He answered them all with the same careful politeness his mother had taught him, but his eyes kept drifting back to the woman behind the counter. She moved through her morning routine like a dance she'd performed 1,000 times. Refilling coffee cups, taking orders, sliding plates across the pass-through window. But he noticed she kept glancing his way when she thought he wasn't looking. When his food arrived, she set the plate down in front of him without ceremony. The eggs were perfect, cooked exactly how he liked them. The hash browns were golden brown and crispy. Even the wheat toast was buttered just right. "Thank you," he said, "just doing my job." But there was something in her voice that suggested it was more than that. Something that said she remembered exactly how he liked his breakfast. Even after all this time, he ate slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of small-town morning conversation. The weather, crop prices, who was sick, who was getting married, whose kids were off to college. The same topics that had filled this place when he was growing up. Comforting in their predictability. When he finished, she refilled his coffee without being asked. The diner had emptied out some as people headed off to their daily routines. It was quieter now, more peaceful. "You look good," she said finally, leaning against the counter across from him. "You too," and she did. She looked exactly like herself. Just a little older, a little more settled into who she was meant to be. There was something steady about her that hadn't been there when they were teenagers. Something that spoke of years spent building a life worth living. "How long you staying?" She asked Dot. It was the question everyone had been asking, but when she said it, it felt different, more important somehow. "Don't know yet," he said honestly. "Depends on a few things." She nodded like she understood, even though he hadn't really explained anything. Maybe that was another thing that hadn't changed about her? She'd always been good at reading between the lines, at understanding what people meant even when they couldn't find the right words. The bell chimed again as someone else came in, and the moment broke. She moved away to take care of the new customer, but not before giving him another one of those small, knowing smiles. He finished his coffee and left money on the counter, including a generous tip. When he stood to leave, she looked up from across the room. "See you around," she said. "Yeah," he replied. "See you around?" Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. The kind of air you only found in small towns, away from highways and cities and all the noise of the modern world. He stood next to his truck for a moment. Looking back through the diner window, she was already back to work, but she glanced up and caught him watching. This time, neither of them looked away first. It was like they were both trying to figure out what happened next. After 8 years of nothing and one morning of everything feeling exactly like it used to, finally, he climbed into his truck and drove away, but he could feel her eyes following him down Main Street. Some things really hadn't changed. The question was whether that was good or bad, and whether either of them was ready to find out. That night, he sat on the porch of his old family home, the place his aunt had been keeping up while he was gone. The house felt too big and too quiet after years of sleeping in bunkhouses and trailer homes. Every creak of the floorboards brought back memories he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. He closed his eyes and let himself remember that last summer before everything changed. 18 years old and feeling like the whole world was waiting for him somewhere beyond the county line. His father's ranch was struggling that year, worse than it had ever been. Drought had killed half the grass, cattle prices were down, and the bank was making noises about overdue payments. His mother had been sick too, though she tried to hide it. Cancer, they found out later, but that summer she just called it being tired. She'd sit on this same porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and trying to pretend everything was normal. But he could see the pain in her eyes, the way she held herself like she was afraid of breaking. The memory that hurt the most wasn't about his parents, though. It was about her. About sitting in his old pickup truck on graduation night, parked out by Miller's Pond where all the kids went to think and talk and figure out their lives. She'd been wearing a blue sundress, the one with tiny flowers on it, that she'd bought for the graduation ceremony. Her hair was loose around her shoulders and she was playing with the radio dial, trying to find a station that wasn't all static. They'd been dating for 2 years by then, ever since sophomore year, when she'd asked him to the winter dance because she said she was tired of waiting for boys to get brave enough to ask. "So you're really going?" she'd said that night, not looking at him, just staring out at the water where the moon was making ripples look like silver coins. "Got to," he'd replied. "There's nothing here for me." It was a stupid thing to say, especially with her sitting right there next to him. But he was 18 and scared and trying to sound tougher than he felt. The truth was, he didn't want to end up like his father, working himself to death on a piece of land that might not even be theirs much longer. "What about college?" She'd asked. "You could go to the state school. It's only 2 hours away." "Can't afford it, you know that." She'd been quiet for a long time after that. Just sat there listening to the night sounds, the frogs and crickets and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. Finally, she turned to look at him with those serious brown eyes. I could wait, she'd said simply. For what? For you to figure things out, for you to come back. He'd laughed, but not because it was funny, because he was scared and 18 and didn't know how to handle someone loving him that much. Don't waste your time waiting for me. You're too good for that. What if I want to waste my time? Then you're crazy. She'd smiled at that, the sad kind of smile that meant she knew something he didn't. Maybe I am crazy, but I know what I want. And what's that? You, she'd said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I want you to go see the world if that's what you need to do, but I want you to come back when you're ready. He tried to talk her out of it. Told her she was young, that she'd meet someone else, someone better, someone who wouldn't leave her sitting by a pond making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But she'd just shaken her head and taken his hand. I'm not asking you to promise anything, she'd said. I'm just telling you what I'm going to do. And I'm going to wait. The last night before he left, they'd sat on the tailgate of his truck in her driveway. Her parents had gone to bed, and the whole neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of sprinklers running on automatic timers. She'd brought him a thermos of coffee and a sandwich for the road, even though he wouldn't be leaving until morning. You sure about this? He'd asked one more time. Are you trying to get rid of me? Trying to be fair to you? Let me worry about what's fair to me. They'd talked until almost dawn about everything and nothing, about their plans and dreams and all the things they wanted to do someday. She was going to study business at the community college, maybe take over Murphy's diner when old man Murphy retired. He was going to work ranches and learn everything he could about cattle and horses and land management. You all right? She'd asked as the sky started getting light. If you want me to. I want you to. When the sun came up, he'd kissed her goodbye. On her front porch. Not the desperate, dramatic kind of kiss you see in movies, but something gentle and sad and full of all the things they couldn't say out loud. She'd tasted like coffee and tears, and he'd wanted to change his mind right then. And there. Take care of yourself, she'd whispered against his ear. You too, and don't you dare feel guilty about leaving. This is what you need to do. He'd driven away that morning with her standing on the porch in her pajamas, waving until he turned the corner and couldn't see her anymore. In his rearview mirror, she'd looked so small against the big front door of her parents' house. Small but strong, like she could handle whatever came next. For the first few months, they'd written letters. Real letters on paper because long distance. Phone calls cost too much money. Hers were full of news about people they'd gone to school with, about the diner and her classes and her family. His were mostly about the work, about learning to handle cattle in different terrain, about the endless sky in Montana and how it made him feel both free and lonely at the same time. But gradually, the letters got shorter and came less often. Life got busy for both of them. He was working dawn to dusk and too tired to write much of anything. She was juggling school and work and probably starting to realize that waiting for someone might be harder than she'd thought. The last letter he'd gotten from her was almost 2 years after he'd left. Just a few lines about how she was doing well, how the diner was keeping her busy, how she hoped he was learning everything he wanted to learn. She'd signed it, Love Always, like she had all the others, but something felt different about it. Final, maybe. He'd started to write back a dozen times, but never finished any of them. What was he supposed to say? That he missed her but wasn't ready to come home? That he was sorry for leaving but not sorry enough to change anything? In the end, he'd said nothing at all, and the silence had stretched between them like the miles. Now, sitting on his porch 8 years later, he wondered if she'd kept waiting like she'd promised, or if she'd finally gotten smart and found someone who knew a good thing when he had it. Part of him hoped she had. The other part, the selfish part, hoped she'd meant what she said that night by the pond. Tomorrow, he decided he'd go back to the diner. Not just for coffee this time, but to find out what 8 years of silence had cost them both. The years had passed like pages in a book he couldn't put down, each chapter taking him further from home and deeper into a life he'd built with his own 2 hands. 8 years of dawn-to-dusk work under skies so big they made him feel small. Learning lessons that no classroom could teach. Montana came first. The Rocking W Ranch, where old cowboys with weathered faces and hearts bigger than the state itself had taken him under their wing. He'd arrived that first summer green as spring grass, thinking he knew something about cattle because he'd grown up around his father's small herd. The ranch foreman, a man called Tex who'd never actually been to Texas, had laughed at his first attempt to rope a calf. "Boy," Tex had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, "you got about as much business with a rope as a fish has with a bicycle." But they'd been patient with him, showed him how to read cattle, how to spot trouble before it started, how to work with horses instead of against them. He'd lived in a bunkhouse with 5 other ranch hands, sharing meals and stories and the kind of easy friendship that comes from working hard together under the open sky. The work was brutal that first year. His hands bled from rope burns, his legs ached from long days in the saddle, and he fell asleep every night so tired he couldn't even dream, but slowly, day by day he got stronger. Learned to anticipate what the cattle would do before they did it. Developed an eye for good horses and bad weather. It was in Montana that he'd met Rebecca, a school teacher from Billings who came out to the ranch sometimes with her students for educational tours. She had auburn hair and green eyes and a laugh that reminded him of wind chimes. She was smart and kind and everything a sensible man should want in a woman. They dated for almost a year. Dinner in town on his days off, long walks by the river, quiet evenings on her front porch talking about books and ideas and dreams for the future. She'd wanted to marry him, settle down, maybe buy a little place outside town where they could raise kids and horses and a garden. "You could get work at any ranch around here," she'd said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "You're good at what you do. People respect you." He'd kissed her forehead and held her close, but something had felt wrong. Not wrong with her because she was perfect, wrong with him. Like he was playing a part in someone else's story instead of living his own. When the job in Colorado came up, he'd taken it. Rebecca had cried when he told her, standing in her kitchen, with flour on her hands from making bread, looking like everything domestic and settled and safe. He tried to explain that he wasn't ready, that he needed to see more, learn more, become more than he was. But how do you tell someone that loving them isn't enough? Colorado brought different lessons. The Circle T Ranch sprawled across high country where the air was thin and the work was even harder. Here he'd learned about breeding programs and genetics, about the business side of ranching that went beyond just keeping cattle alive. The ranch owner, a woman who'd inherited the place from her father and built it into something bigger than he'd ever dreamed, had seen potential in him. "You've got good instincts," she told him after he'd spotted a sick bull before anyone else noticed the symptoms. "But instincts only get you so far. You need to understand the science behind what you're doing." She'd loaned him books on animal husbandry and ranch management, encouraged him to take correspondence courses in business and accounting. Slowly, his education had expanded beyond what he could learn with his hands. He'd started to see the bigger picture, the way successful ranches operated not just as places where cattle lived, but as complex businesses that had to adapt and grow to survive. It was in Colorado that he'd gotten involved with Maria, a veterinarian who worked with several ranches in the valley. She was passionate about her work, dedicated to healing animals and helping ranchers improve their herds. She spoke 3 languages and had traveled all over the world before settling in Colorado to build her practice. Their relationship had been intense and complicated. She challenged him intellectually in ways he'd never experienced, pushed him to think about things beyond ranch work and small-town life. They talked about traveling together, maybe going to Australia or Argentina to see how ranching worked. In other countries, "You're wasting your potential staying in one place," she'd told him during one of their long conversations about the future. "You could do anything, go anywhere. Why limit yourself?" But even as she'd encouraged him to dream bigger, something had felt hollow about those dreams. The places she described sounded exciting, but they didn't feel like home. And when he'd tried to imagine himself in those far-off places, the picture never quite came into focus. After 2 years, Maria had gotten an offer to work with a wildlife conservation program in Africa. She'd wanted him to come with her to start a completely new adventure together. Instead, he'd helped her pack and driven her to the airport, both of them knowing that sometimes people are meant to walk together for a while, but not forever. New Mexico had been his last stop before coming home. The Lazy S Ranch, where he'd finally learned to train cutting horses, the smart, athletic animals that could separate a single cow from a herd with barely any guidance from their rider. It was precise, almost artistic work that required patience and understanding and the kind of quiet communication between horse and rider that couldn't be taught, only developed through years of practice. The ranch owner's daughter, a woman named Catherine, who'd grown up around horses and could ride better than most men, had become his teacher and eventually something more. She understood the work in ways that Rebecca and Maria never could, shared his love for the land and the animals, and the simple satisfaction of a job done well. For a while, he'd thought maybe this was it. Maybe Catherine was the answer to the restless feeling that had driven him from place to place for so many years. She was beautiful and capable and loved the same things he loved. They'd talked about partnership, about building something together that would last, but late at night, lying in his narrow bunk in the ranch's guest quarters, he'd found himself thinking about a girl in a blue sundress sitting by a pond promising to wait, about brown eyes and the smell of coffee and a laugh that had sounded like coming home. He'd tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on the life he was building with Catherine, but the memories had a way of creeping back when he least expected them. When Catherine laughed at something funny, he'd find himself comparing the sound to another laugh from long ago. When she tucked her hair behind her ear, he'd remember someone else who'd made the same gesture. Catherine had noticed his distraction, the way he sometimes seemed to be looking past her toward something she couldn't see. One evening, as they'd watched the horses in the pasture, she'd asked him directly, "Who is she?" He'd tried to deny it, to convince both of them that there was no one else. But Catherine was too smart and too honest for lies. "Someone from home," he'd finally admitted, "and you never got over her." It wasn't a question, and he hadn't tried to make it into one. They'd ended things quietly, with the kind of mutual respect that comes from recognizing a truth neither of you wanted to face. Catherine had wished him well and told him he was a fool if he didn't go back and find out if that someone was still waiting. 8 years and 3 broken hearts later, he was finally ready to find out if some promises were stronger than time and distance. If some kinds of love could survive 8 years of silence and the weight of all the roads he'd traveled trying to forget. 3 days had passed since his first morning at the diner, and the questions were eating at him like a slow burn. He'd driven past the place twice without stopping, telling himself he needed time to think, to figure out what he really wanted to know, but the truth was simpler than that. He was scared of the answers. The barbershop on Main Street seemed like a safe place to start. Old Pete had been cutting hair in the same chair for 40 years, and if there was gossip to be heard, in Cedar Valley, Pete's shop was where it lived and breathed. The man could remember what you'd had for breakfast 3 Tuesdays ago, let alone who was dating whom in a town of 800 people. "Just a trim," he said, settling into the worn leather chair that had probably been there since Pete opened the place. "You bet," Pete said, snapping the cape around his neck. "Good to see you getting settled back in. Town's been different without the Morrison family around." Pete's hands were steady despite his age, the scissors making small, precise cuts while he talked. The shop smelled like hair tonic and old leather, familiar smells that brought back memories of Saturday mornings, when his father would bring him in for haircuts before they went to the hardware store. "Different how?" he asked, watching Pete's reflection in the mirror. "Oh, quieter. Your folks were good people. Always involved in things. Church committee, school board, that sort of thing. Town lost something when they passed. His parents had died within 6 months of each other while he was in Colorado. Cancer had taken his mother first, just like they'd feared that last summer. His father had followed soon after, the doctor said from a heart attack, but everyone knew it was really from loneliness. He'd come back for both funerals, brief, painful visits where he'd stood at gravesides feeling like a stranger in his own hometown. "What about other folks?" he asked carefully. "Everyone else doing okay?" Pete's eyes met his in the mirror, and there was something knowing in the old man's expression. You asking about anyone in particular? Just curious about people I used to know. Well, let's see. The Johnson boy went off to college and never came back. Works for some computer company in Dallas now. The Martinez girl became a nurse, married. A doctor from the next county over. Got 3 kids and a big house with a swimming pool. Pete paused in his cutting, considering. Course, some folks never left at all. Never even tried to leave. The hint wasn't subtle, but Pete had never been known for subtlety. That so? Take that girl from the diner. Been working there since she finished school. Could have done anything she wanted, smart as she is. But she stayed right here, took care of her mama when she got sick, took over the diner when Murphy decided to retire to Florida. Seems like she's done well for herself. Oh, she has. Real well, bought the building, fixed it up nice. Makes the best coffee in 3 counties, and her pie could win contests if she ever entered any. Funny thing, though. Pete had stopped cutting entirely now, focusing all his attention on the story. What's funny about it? Never married. Now that's not unusual in itself. Plenty of folks stay single by choice these days. But this girl, she's had opportunities. 3 different men asked her to marry them over the years. Good men, too. The banker's son, that teacher who moved here from Austin, even Doc Wilson's nephew when he was visiting from San Antonio. Something cold settled in his stomach. And said no to every one of them. Real polite about it, mind you. Always said the timing wasn't right, or she wasn't ready, or she had too much going on with the diner. But her sister, now she had different ideas about what was really going on. Pete resumed cutting, but his pace was slower now, like he was savoring the telling of a story he'd been waiting years to share. Her sister works at the bank, you know. Sweet girl, married a nice boy from over in Millerville. Got 2 little ones and another on the way. That's nice. She came in here about a month ago with her youngest, getting his first haircut. We got to talking about this and that, and somehow your name came up. How you'd been gone so long, whether anyone thought you'd ever come back. The scissors had stopped moving again. Pete was watching his face in the mirror with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading people's expressions and reactions. And what did she say? Said her sister keeps a photo in her wallet, old picture from some high school dance. Prom, maybe, or homecoming. Been carrying it around for 8 years, far as anyone knows. The world seemed to tilt slightly. 8 years. All this time, while he'd been learning about cattle and horses and trying to build a life that felt like it fit, she'd been carrying around a picture of them together. Could be she's just sentimental, he said, but his voice sounded strange. Even to himself. Could be, Pete agreed. Course, it's also possible that some folks keep promises even when the other person tells them not to. The old man's words hung in the air between them like morning mist. Pete had finished the haircut, but he made no move to remove the cape or brush away the loose hair. They both knew this conversation was about more than grooming. Pete, he said, quietly, what do you think happened? Really? The barber set down his scissors and leaned against his workstation, studying the younger man's face. You want my honest opinion? Yeah, I think that girl loved you more than you knew how to handle. When you were 18, I think you did what you thought was right, letting her go so she could have a life without waiting around for someone who might never come back. And I think she decided that waiting was exactly what she wanted to do. That's crazy. Maybe, or maybe she knew something you didn't know yet. Like what? Like that some people are worth waiting for, even when they're too young and scared to know they're worth it. Pete began brushing the loose hair from his shoulders, the soft bristles scratching against his neck. Course, 8 years is a long time. People change. Maybe she's different now. Maybe you're different now. I am different. Different how? He thought about it while Pete removed the cape and shook it out. Different in ways he was still figuring out himself. Older, obviously. More confident in some ways, less certain in others. He'd learned about work and responsibility and what it meant to build something with your own hands. But he'd also learned about loneliness and regret and the weight of choices. Made too quickly. I know what I want now, he said finally. And what's that? To find out if it's too late. Pete nodded as if this was exactly the answer he'd been expecting. Well then, guess you better go find out. Walking out of the barber shop, he felt like he was carrying some kind of secret knowledge. The photo in her wallet changed everything, and nothing at the same time. It meant she'd thought about him, remembered him, maybe even missed him. But it didn't tell him what she was thinking now, today. After 8 years of silence, the afternoon sun was warm on his face as he walked down Main Street, past the hardware store and the post office and all the other places that held pieces of his childhood. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd go back to the diner. Not just for coffee this time, but for answers to questions he was finally brave enough to ask. Got the photo in her wallet. 8 years of keeping his memory close enough to touch. Maybe Pete was right. Maybe some people really were worth waiting for, even when they were too young and scared to believe it themselves. The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. He'd been awake since 4, lying in his childhood bed and staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations that would probably never happen the way he imagined them. By the time the sun started creeping through the curtains, he'd given up on sleep and decided that coffee was more important than courage. The diner was busy when he walked in, filled with the usual morning crowd of ranchers and early risers. She was behind the counter, hair pulled back in a messy bun, a pencil tucked behind her ear as she juggled 3 different orders. She looked up when the bell chimed, and their eyes met for just a second before she had to turn back to her work. He found an empty booth in the corner and waited. Watched her move through her routine with the kind of easy efficiency that comes from years of practice. She remembered how everyone liked their coffee without asking, knew which customers wanted their eggs scrambled and which ones preferred them over easy. There was something comforting about her competence. The way she made everyone feel taken care of. When the breakfast rush finally slowed down, she came over with a coffee pot and turned his cup right side up. Morning. She poured the coffee without spilling a drop, even though her hands seemed a little less steady than usual. The usual? Yeah, thanks. She wrote down his order and stuck the ticket up for the cook, then surprised him by sliding into the booth across from him. Slow morning. Mind if I sit for a minute? Course not. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them seeming to understand that something important was happening but neither quite sure how to start. The diner hummed around them with quiet conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. So, she said finally, Pete says you got a haircut yesterday. He laughed, running a hand through his newly trimmed hair. News travels fast in this town. Always has. You remember how it was in high school? Someone would sneeze in first period, and by lunch the whole school would know about it. Some things never change. Some things do, though. There was weight behind her words, and he found himself studying her face, looking for clues about what she was really saying. She'd always been good at that, at saying one thing while meaning another, trusting him to understand the layers underneath. You look good, she said, and there was no pretense in it. Just honest observation. You said that the other day. Still true. His eggs arrived, interrupting whatever moment they'd been building. She moved to get up, but he caught her hand without thinking. The touch was electric, familiar, and strange at the same time. Stay, he said, if you can. She looked down at their joined hands, and he thought she might pull away. Instead, she settled back into the booth, but he let go of her hand, not wanting to push too hard too fast. Tell me about the diner, he said, picking up his fork. Pete said you bought the building 2 years ago. Murphy was ready to retire. Wanted to move to Florida to be near his grandkids. Bank was willing to work with me on the loan. That's great. Really great. It's been good, lot of work, but good work. I put in new equipment, updated the kitchen, added some items to the menu. Nothing too fancy, but people seemed to like the changes. He could hear the pride in her voice, and it made something warm spread through his chest. She'd always been smart, always had good ideas about how to make things better. It didn't surprise him that she'd taken something good and made it even better. What about you? She asked. Pete said you've been working ranches. Montana, Colorado, New Mexico. Learned a lot about cattle and horses. Different ways of doing things. Did you like it? The traveling? It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. The real question underneath was whether he'd been happy being gone, whether leaving had given him what he'd been looking for. Parts of it, he said honestly. The work was good. Met some good people, learned things I never would have learned staying here. But, he met her eyes across the table, but it never felt like home. Something shifted in her expression, but before she could respond, the bell chimed and more customers came in. She glanced toward the counter, where the coffee pot was getting low and people were starting to look around for refills. I should get back to work, she said. Yeah, of course. But she didn't move right away. Just sat there looking at him like she was trying to memorize his face. Will you be back tomorrow? If you want me to be, I want you to be. It became a routine after that. Every morning at 7, he'd come in for coffee and eggs and conversation. Sometimes they'd talk about safe things, about the weather and local news and people they'd both known in school. Other times, the conversations went deeper, touching on dreams and disappointments and all the things that had happened in the years between. She told him about taking care of her mother during the last year of her life, how cancer had stolen the woman's strength bit by bit but never touched her spirit, about the night she'd decided to buy the diner, sitting in her empty childhood bedroom and realizing she wanted to build something that would last. He told her about learning to train cutting horses in New Mexico, the patience and trust it required, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and waking up to sunrises that painted the whole world gold and orange and pink. What they didn't talk about was the past they'd shared, or why he'd really come back, or what it meant that she was still single after all these years. Those conversations hung in the air between them like morning fog, visible but not quite solid enough to grab hold of. Other people in town started to notice. Mrs. Henderson made a point of walking past the diner every morning during his breakfast, peering through the windows with unconcealed curiosity. The mechanic at the garage asked him if he was planning to stick around this time. Even the mailman started making jokes about how regular his schedule had become. Whole town's got money riding on you too, Pete mentioned during his next haircut. Even odds on whether you'll ask her out before the 4th of July. People need hobbies, he said, but he wasn't really annoyed. There was something comforting about being part of the town's daily drama, about mattering enough for people to care what happened next. 3 weeks into his new routine, she surprised him by asking a question that cut straight to the heart of things. Why did you really come back? They were sitting in their usual booth, the morning rush over and the diner quiet except for the radio playing softly in the background. Her coffee cup was empty, and she was turning it slowly in her hands. Not looking at him, you know why? He said. I want to hear you say it. He set down his fork and looked at her, really looked at her. At the woman she'd become, strong and capable and beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with how she looked. At the girl she'd been, who'd promised to wait for him even when he'd told her not to. I came back for you, he said simply. She nodded, like she'd been expecting that answer, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. And what if I'm not the same person you left behind? Then I guess we'll have to figure out who we are now. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. But it was honest, and it was a beginning, and maybe that was enough for now. The explosion came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after their honest conversation in the booth. He'd been sitting in his truck outside the diner, waiting for her to finish closing up. It had become another part of their routine, him offering to walk her to her car even though the distance was maybe 50 feet and Cedar Valley hadn't seen a serious crime since someone stole Mrs. Peterson's garden gnomes back in 2019, but tonight felt different. She'd been quiet during his morning visit, distracted in a way that made him think something was bothering her. When she'd refilled his coffee, her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. When he'd asked if everything was okay, she'd just said she was tired and left it at that. Now, watching her lock up the diner, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she moved like she was carrying some invisible weight. When she turned and saw him sitting there, instead of the usual wave and smile, she walked straight over to his truck with purpose in every step. We need to talk, she said through his open window. Okay, want to go somewhere, or out back, now? Something in her tone made his stomach drop. but he followed her around to the back of the diner where she kept her car parked. The alley was lit by a single streetlight that buzzed and flickered, casting uneven shadows on the gravel. She leaned against her car and crossed her arms, and suddenly he was 18 again, in trouble for something he didn't quite understand. "What's this really about?" she asked without any kind of build-up. "What do you mean?" "This whole thing. You coming back, the breakfast routine, the walks to my car? What do you really want from me?" Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that sounded like hurt mixed with anger. He'd never heard that particular combination from her before, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. "I told you why I came back." "You said you came back for me? But what does that actually mean? What do you expect to happen here?" He opened his mouth to answer, but she kept going, the words coming faster now, like water through a broken dam. "Because I need to know if this is real or if you're just feeling nostalgic about the good old days. I need to know if you're planning to stick around this time or if you're going to get bored and disappear again when something more interesting comes along." "I'm not going anywhere. How do I know that?" "How do I know you won't wake up 6 months from now and decide that small town life isn't exciting enough for you anymore?" The streetlight buzzed above them, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. He could hear the frustration in her voice, but underneath that was something deeper, something that sounded like fear. "You don't know," he said quietly. "I guess you'll just have to trust me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Trust you? You left me sitting by a pond 8 years ago after I told you I'd wait. You told me not to waste my time. Then you disappeared for 8 years without so much as a phone call? And now you want me to trust you?" Each word hit him like a physical blow. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd hurt her, badly, and all the morning conversations in the world couldn't change that fact. "I was 18, he said, knowing how weak it sounded. "So was I, but I kept my promise anyway. I know you did." "Pete told me about the photo." Her face went white, then red. "He told you about what?" "The picture, in your wallet, from prom." For a moment she looked like she might cry or hit him or both. Then her expression hardened into something he'd never seen before, something that made her look like a stranger. "That was private. That was mine. I didn't ask him to tell me. He just ... He just thought you had a right to know? Thought it would make you feel better about yourself? Well, congratulations. You figured out that the pathetic girl who couldn't get over her high school boyfriend kept carrying around a stupid picture for 8 years. It's not pathetic, isn't it? Because that's sure how it feels right now." She pushed herself away from the car and started pacing in the small circle of light from the street lamp. Her hair had come loose from its ponytail, and she kept pushing it back from her face with shaking hands. "Do you know how many people have felt sorry for me over the years? How many times I've had to listen to people tell me I should move on? Find someone else? Stop wasting my youth on someone who obviously wasn't coming back? I didn't know ... Of course you didn't know. You weren't here. You were off finding yourself or whatever it is you were doing for 8 years while I was here building a life and pretending it was enough." The words hung between them like a challenge. He wanted to reach for her, to somehow fix the pain he could see in her eyes, but something in her posture warned him to keep his distance. "I built a good life," she continued, her voice getting stronger. "I took care of my mama when she was sick. I made the diner profitable. I bought my own house, paid my own bills, made my own decisions. I have friends and a business and a place in this community. I'm not some tragic figure waiting by the window for a man who might never come home. I know you're not, but I did wait. God help me, I waited anyway. And do you want to know the worst part?" He nodded, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to. "Hear it. The worst part is that I'm not sorry. Even now, standing here feeling like an idiot, I'm not sorry I waited. Because the alternative was settling for something less than what I wanted, and I refused to do that." She stopped pacing and looked at him directly, and in the flickering streetlight he could see tears on her cheeks. "But I won't do it again. I won't put my life on hold for someone who might decide to leave when things get complicated or boring or real. So, if you're here because you're lonely or curious or having some kind of midlife crisis at 26, then you need to figure that out somewhere else." What if I'm here because I finally grew up enough to know what I lost when I left? Then prove it. The challenge in her voice was clear, but so was the hurt underneath it. She wasn't asking for words or promises or grand gestures. She was asking for something much harder than that. How? I don't know. But actions matter more than words. And your actions 8 years ago told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in your priorities. If you want that to change, if you want me to believe you're different now, then you're going to have to show me. She walked past him toward her car, then stopped and turned back. And just so we're clear, I'm not the same girl who sat by that pond and promised to wait. I'm stronger now and smarter, and I know what I'm worth. If you can't handle that, if you're looking for someone who'll just be grateful you came back, then you're looking for the wrong person. She got in her car and drove away, leaving him standing alone under the buzzing street light with the taste of failure in his mouth and the weight of 8 years' worth of mistakes on his shoulders. He'd wanted honesty, and he'd gotten it. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. The silence that followed their confrontation stretched for 3 days. 3 long days where he didn't go to the diner, didn't drive past her house, didn't even walk down Main Street where he might accidentally run into her. Instead, he spent those days driving the back roads around Cedar Valley, thinking about what she'd said and what it really meant to prove himself to someone who'd already been hurt too much. On the 4th day, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He drove to the bank. The loan officer, a man who'd gone to school with his older brother, looked confused when he explained what he wanted to do. You want to buy back your family's ranch? The whole property. That's right. Son, that's 800 acres of land, plus the house and all the outbuildings. Bank's been trying to sell it for 3 years, but it needs a lot of work. The house has been sitting empty, the fences are down in places, and the wells haven't been tested in. I know what condition it's in. I've been out there. And he had. The morning after their fight, he'd driven out to the old home place and walked every acre he could cover. Seen the broken fence posts and the overgrown pastures, the house where paint was peeling off the siding and weeds were growing up through the porch boards. It looked like exactly what it was, a dream that had died slowly and been abandoned. But underneath all that neglect, the bones were still good. The land was still fertile, the wells would run clean with some work, and the house just needed someone who cared enough to bring it back to life. You got the money for something like this? The loan officer asked, pulling out a thick folder. I've got savings from 8 years of ranch work. No debt, good credit, and I know how to fix what's broken. It took 2 weeks to get through all the paperwork, inspections, and approvals. 2 weeks where he kept his distance from the diner, but made sure everyone in town knew what he was doing. Because that was the point, wasn't it? Not just to buy the ranch, but to make it clear to everyone, especially her, that he was planning to stay. The day he got the keys, he drove straight out to the property and stood on the front porch of the house where he'd grown up. The view was exactly like he remembered, rolling hills stretching to the horizon, a creek that ran year-round and enough. Good grass to support a decent herd once he got the fences fixed. He started with the house because it needed the most work and because fixing it felt like fixing something in himself. New shingles for the roof, fresh paint for the siding, replacement boards for the porch. He worked from dawn to dusk, his hands, remembering skills his father had taught him, skills he'd improved over 8 years of making other people's places better. Word got around fast in a town the size of Cedar Valley. The hardware store owner started keeping extra supplies in stock, knowing he'd be in every few days for something. Neighbors he barely remembered started stopping by to see how the work was going, some of them offering help or advice or just a cold beer at the end of a long day. Good to see the Morrison place coming back to life, said Mrs. Patterson, whose farm bordered his on the south side. Your daddy would be proud. He hoped that was true. Some days, working on the house where his father had raised him, he felt like he could almost hear the old man's voice offering guidance or pointing out something he'd missed. It was comforting and sad at the same time, like having a conversation with a ghost. 3 weeks into the renovation, her dishwasher broke down at the diner. He heard about it from Pete, who mentioned it casually during a haircut like it was just another piece of local news. Shame about that dishwasher. Things been acting up for months, and now it's finally given up completely. She's been washing everything by hand since Tuesday. That evening, he drove to the appliance store in the next town over and bought a new commercial dishwasher. Had it delivered to the diner the next morning before she opened, along with installation and a warranty that would cover repairs for the next 5 years. He made sure he wasn't there when it arrived. Didn't want it to seem like he was expecting gratitude or recognition. But Pete mentioned the next day that she'd asked around until she found out who'd sent it, and that she'd looked like she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or angry. A week later, her car broke down in the parking lot behind the diner, the transmission, according to Tommy, at the garage, and the repair would cost more than the car was worth. So he bought her a truck, not a new truck, because that would have been too much, too obvious, but a good used pickup, reliable and practical, the kind of vehicle that made sense for someone who had to haul supplies for a restaurant and drive on country roads that weren't always in the best condition. Again, he arranged for it to be delivered anonymously, the keys handed over with a note that said simply, "From a friend." But in a town like Cedar Valley, anonymous didn't last long, and by evening everyone knew who'd bought it. This time she showed up at his ranch. He was on the roof replacing the last section of damaged shingles when he heard a truck door slam in his driveway. When he looked down, she was standing next to the new pickup, hands on her hips, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read from that distance. "You planning to come down, or are we going to have this conversation with you on the roof?" she called up. He climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on an old rag. She looked good, better than good, even though he could see the tension in the way she held herself. "Nice truck," he said. "It is a nice truck, expensive truck. You need reliable transportation. What I need is for you to stop trying to buy your way back into my life." Her words stung, but he'd been expecting them. "That's not what I'm doing." "Isn't it? First the dishwasher, now this, what's next? You going to pay off my mortgage? Buy me a new wardrobe?" "The dishwasher broke down. Your car died. I help fix problems." "That's what neighbors do." "Neighbors don't spend $20,000 on problems that aren't theirs to solve." She was right, and they both knew it. But he was tired of dancing around the real issue, tired of pretending this was about appliances and vehicles, instead of about 8 years of hurt and the question of whether some mistakes could be forgiven. "I'm not trying to buy anything," he said quietly. "I'm trying to show you that I'm here to stay, that I'm not going anywhere this time, by throwing money around, by taking care of the people I care about, by being useful, by proving that I understand what commitment means." She looked at the house behind him, taking in the new roof and fresh paint, the repaired porch and the neat stack of lumber waiting for the next project. "You bought the ranch." "I bought the ranch. Why?" "Because this is home. Because I want to build something here that lasts. Because I want you to know that when I say I'm staying, I mean it." She was quiet for a long time, looking at the house and the land and him. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been. "I can't keep the truck." "Why not?" "Because accepting gifts like that changes things between us. Makes it complicated. It's already complicated. I know. But this makes it complicated in the wrong way." She tossed him the keys, and he caught them reflexively. "When you figure out how to prove you're staying without trying to buy me, let me know." She turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back. "But the dishwasher can stay." That was practical, and the diner needed it. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall she'd built around herself, small enough that he might have imagined it. But he didn't think he had. 2 months passed like seasons changing, slow and steady, but with something building underneath. He kept working on the ranch, kept his distance from the diner, except for occasional meals when he was in town for supplies. No more grand gestures, no more expensive gifts. Just the quiet work of building a life that would last. The transformation of the Morrison place became the talk of Cedar Valley. People would drive by on weekends just to see the progress, watching as the old house came back to life board by board, fence post by fence post. He bought a small herd of cattle and some horses, brought in new equipment, and hired 2 part-time hands to help with the daily work. But it was the small things that people noticed most. How he'd helped Mrs. Patterson fix her broken gate without being asked. How he'd driven old Mr. Henderson to the doctor when the man's truck wouldn't start. How he'd shown up with his truck and trailer when the Martinez family needed help moving their daughter to college. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, especially not her. He was just being who he'd learned to be during 8 years of working for other people, understanding that being part of a community meant showing up when you were needed. She noticed too. Though she tried not to let it show, he'd catch glimpses of her sometimes, driving past when he was working in the front pasture, or standing in the diner window when he was loading supplies at the hardware store across the street. Their eyes would meet for a second before one of them looked away, and he'd wonder what she was thinking. The Founders' Day festival came around in early October, the same celebration that had been happening in Cedar Valley for as long as anyone could remember. Main Street would be closed to traffic, local businesses would set up booths, and there'd be a dance in the community center that night with music provided by whatever band they could convince to drive out from the city. He almost didn't go. Spent the afternoon working on a stubborn gate latch that didn't really need fixing, telling himself that festivals weren't his thing anyway. But as the sun started setting and he could hear music drifting across the fields from town, something pulled him toward the shower and his one good shirt. The community center was decorated with the same paper streamers and balloon arches that had been used for every town event since he was a kid. The same families were there, kids running around between the tables while their parents talked and laughed and caught up on gossip. The same band from 5 years ago was playing the same mix of country, classics and old rock songs that everyone could dance to. He stood near the back wall with a cup of punch that tasted like it had been made from a recipe. That hadn't changed since 1987, watching the dancers and trying to decide if staying had been a mistake. That's when he saw her. She was sitting at a table with her friends, wearing a blue dress that reminded him of another dress from another night 8 years ago. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and when she laughed at something one of her friends said, the sound carried across the room and hit him like a physical thing. She looked beautiful, but that wasn't what made his breath catch. She looked happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with him or their complicated history. She'd built a good life for herself, exactly like she'd said. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. Her friend Kelly, the one who'd married the bank president's son, leaned over and said something that made her glance toward where he was standing. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment the music and conversation seemed to fade into background noise. Then Kelly said something else, and she shook her head with a smile that looked both amused and exasperated. He couldn't hear what they were talking about, but he could guess. In a town this size, his presence at the dance wouldn't go unnoticed by anyone, especially not by her friends. The band finished a fast song and transitioned into something slower, something that invited couples onto the dance floor. He watched as married pairs and dating teenagers and even some of the older folks made their way to the center of the room, moving together with the easy comfort of people who'd been dancing together for years. That's when Kelly stood up and walked over to him. "She's being stubborn," Kelly said without any kind of introduction. "About what?" "About admitting that she's been watching you all night. About admitting that she wants to dance with you, but she's too proud to make the first move." He glanced over at the table where she was now pointedly not looking in his direction. "Maybe she just doesn't want to dance." "Trust me, she wants to dance. She's been tapping her foot to the music for the last half hour. But she's convinced herself that if she shows any interest, it means she's giving in or going backward or some other nonsense." Kelly crossed her arms and fixed him with the kind of look that wives and mothers everywhere had perfected. "So, the question is, are you going to stand over here feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to go ask her to dance? She might say no. She might, but she might also say yes. And you'll never know if you don't ask." Before he could think of another excuse, Kelly was walking back to the table. He watched her sit down and lean over to whisper something in her friend's ear, saw the way her eyes widened and her cheeks flushed pink. The song was winding down, but the band was already starting the next one. Something slow and sweet that he recognized from their senior prom, when they'd been young and sure that love was simple and that promises were easy to keep. He took a deep breath and started walking across the room. Each step felt like it took forever and no time at all. By the time he reached her table, his heart was beating so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. She looked up at him, and he could see the war playing out in her eyes. Part of her wanted to say yes, he could tell, but part of her was still protecting herself, still afraid of being hurt again. Her friends were all watching with the kind of intense interest that came from being invested in a story they'd been following for months. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, she placed her hand in his. "One dance." "One dance," he agreed. They walked to the dance floor together, and when he put his arms around her, it felt like coming home and starting over at the same time. She was different now, stronger and more sure of herself, but she still fit against him like she'd been made for that exact spot. They moved together slowly, carefully, both of them hyper-aware of every point of contact. The song was one they'd danced to before in the same room, when the world had been full of possibilities and they'd thought they had all the time in the world to figure things out. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you, I mean it." "You look happy," she pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "I'm happy, that's what I've been trying to tell you. I built a good life here. I know you did, I can see it. So why are you here? What do you really want from me?" It was the same question she'd asked in the alley behind the diner, but this time her voice was curious rather than angry. This time she really wanted to know the answer. "I want to be part of that life," he said honestly. "Not to fix it or change it or make it better, just to be part of it if you'll have me." The song was ending, but neither of them made any move to step away. Around them, other couples were changing partners or leaving the dance floor, but they stayed exactly where they were. "You could choose any girl," she said quietly, echoing something Kelly had said earlier about all the single women in 3 counties who'd made their interest obvious since he'd been back. He smiled, the first real smile he'd felt in months. "I only want the one who never left." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were the good kind of tears, the kind that came with relief and joy and the feeling that something that had been broken was finally being made whole again. "I never left," she whispered. "Even when I should have, even when everyone told me to, I never left." "I know, and I'm never leaving again." This time, when he kissed her, it wasn't goodbye. It was hello and welcome home and all the promises. They had been too young to make the first time around, but were finally ready to keep.